we went through this last night. This is, Bosquet is incredibly difficult to find almost all of his works in English at all. It's, oh my God. Last night's review was a lot. I think I came away with a general understanding of this, but we'll be doing what we can to make our way through it, which is fine. Yeah. But I hope everyone's doing pretty well. We'll go ahead and kick off here, and if as people join, they join. We'll just pick up as we go. So I'll kick off. Hello, and thank all of you for joining us on this lovely Monday for our ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we hit series 21, the series of the event. No major announcements. I'm not in the mood to go through a ton of them today. The big sort of things to note, especially if you're in this room, because we love all of you. We are trying to put on and have a semblance of a Divagations conference. We're calling it Divagations. It's our play at trying to do something a little bit different with the power the server has somehow gotten. So please, if you have a desire to take part, a way to help, want to contribute, or just if you're curious in any way, hit up the announcements section for the Divagation conference. Say hi. We'll be doing a few more announcements around that.
Yeah, we'll have a call sheet out soon, and there'll be a Google form that everyone can fill in, and we'll start updating from there.
Yeah, we'll have some good shit for all of that, which is nice. The other thing, well, that's the big stuff. Follow us on Twitter, DNGQC. I'm debating on deleting the fucking Twitter account. I hate social media so much. And Patreon, DGQC, if you like what we're doing. But with that out of the way, I want to move into this 21st series of the event. We're debated on where we would actually even start this discussion, because there's a lot that happens sort of early on, but I think actually reading the first paragraph, which we haven't done a lot in this. Usually I do my readings the night before, which I did, and I kind of forego that, but I think this opening will give us a place to actually kick off and discuss, unless someone has a better idea, which I'm very open to, trust me. All right. I'll just open up then. We are sometimes hesitant to call Stoic a concrete... Nope, Derek, you got something?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. I just think it's worth noting that this 21st series is like a continuation of the one we did last week. So it's a kind of, it's going in further depth. So rather than a kind of a new topic, it's kind of developing that further, I would say. And so last week we talked about the event as a kind of combination of the representation and expression, and the way in which the representation encompasses the expression. So I think these ideas will come up in this as we go through it.
Actually, that is a really fair point. It's pretty spot on, because, I mean, we're going to open up, and he opens up talking about the ethics of things and ethics sort of itself. And with the 20th series being the moral problem in Stoic philosophy, talking about representation and expression and usage, how the sage wills the event if the corporeal cause is not already producing it. Like great little lines like that end with, and actually that may be even better, ends with him saying, this is how the Stoic sage not only comprehends and wills the event, but also represents it, and by this selects it. The use of the mime. One stops going from the greatest present toward a future and past which are said only of a smaller present. On the contrary, one goes from the future and past as unlimited all the way to the smallest present of pure instant, which is endlessly subdivided. This play, the beginning with a pure event, the mime directs and doubles the actualization, measures the mixtures with the aid of an instant without mixture, and prevents them from overflowing. And this, spot on, Derek, flows right into the 21st series of the event, which I still think we should read out. We are sometimes hesitant to call Stoic a concrete or poetic way of life, as if the name of a doctrine were too bookish or abstract to designate the most personal relation with a wound. But where do doctrines come from, if not from wounds and vital aphorisms, with which, with their charge of exemplary provocation, are so many speculative anecdotes? Gilles Bosque must be called Stoic. He apprehends the wound that he bears deep within his body, and its eternal truth is a pure event. To the extent that events are actualized in us, they wait for us to invite us in. They signal us, quote, "My wound existed before me, I was born to embody it." It is a question of attaining this will that the event creates in us, of becoming the quasi-cause of what is produced within us, the operator, of producing surfaces and linings in which the event is reflected, finds itself again as incorporeal and manifests in us the neutral splendor which it possesses in itself, in its impersonal and pre-individual nature, beyond the general and the particular, the collective and the private. It is a question of becoming a citizen of the world. Quote, "Everything was in order with the events of my life before I made them mine. To live them is to find myself tempted to become their equal, as if they had to get from me only that which they have that is best and most perfect." There's a lot actually in that first paragraph, but to just build out on Jobisque because, or Bosque, or I'm going to just ruin so much there. Derek pasted, there's a lot of really interesting reading to be done on him. Sadly, his stuff has not translated into English. Apparently, a handful of posts I found said that it's almost impossible as far as his like real writing, because there's so much that just gets lost in the translation. But he himself was someone who was wounded during World War I badly, and actually spent the rest of his life in bed. The photos of him are pretty oddly adorable, of him like kind of smiling or writing, or have all of his books around him with these comforters around him on this giant bed. And he very much owned it. They owned the fact that he was in this bed and paralyzed, and his work deals excessively with the nature of how he came to accept this, or what it means to accept this, or what it means to, what it meant for him to sort of be paralyzed, or to be who he was and what matters. And the line Deleuze has, which I really like, is, "He apprehends the wound that he bears deep within his body in its eternal truth as a pure event." It's a really clean way of putting it. I will leave it open for anyone to jump in at this point, because there's a lot for us to discuss at the start, but please, anyone want to expand?
Yeah, I think it's at the beginning, the first sentence. I think there's a reference there to this poet, Gilles Bousquet. So he said, "We are sometimes hesitant to call Stoic a concrete or poetic way of life." And I think that's a reference to Bousquet himself, the way he lived his life, a poetic way of life. So Deleuze starts by saying, should we call him Stoic? As if, and he says, if the name of doctrine is too bookish or abstract to designate the most personal relation with a wound. So this is a kind of Bousquet's relation with his wound. But he, as he will say soon, he said Bousquet is it must be called Stoic. And then he goes on the second sentence, where do doctrines come from if not from wounds and vital aphorisms? So he said that it's, I think he signals a hesitancy between saying Bousquet's kind of with his as a poet and his poetic way of life and his relationship to the wound, which is very, as you say, is very, he makes very clear. He said, can we call him a Stoic? But then he says, we must call him a Stoic, essentially. He said, because doctrines such as Stoicism come from wounds and vital aphorisms with their charge of exemplary provocations. So he then says, Gilles Bousquet must be called Stoic. And I think that what this series is about, it's about how we apprehend the event within ourselves. So I think Bousquet is a kind of an example of someone who Deleuze believes has done that, very kind of consciously apprehended the event as in terms of the wound. And he's kind of using that as an example, I would say.
Well, I also like just the opening line where it's, We're hesitant to call the Stoic a concrete or poetic way of life, as if the name of a doctrine were too bookish or abstract to designate the most personal relation with the wound. It's a hesitance that I think emotionally I also understand. The naming something or saying, oh, this is the way of life, but then having to deal with the things that it touches or what a way of life necessarily does by calling it a thing. I just like the wording around that. And kind of how I read these first 2 or 3 sentences, not to disagree. I don't disagree with anything you said, Derek, at all. But the way I read these is him saying, we generally don't want to say that Stoicism is the way of life because it's by nature like sort of a level removed from these wounds. But however, doctrines like this come straight from such wounds. The reality of how to live a life, the abstractions of what to do, ultimately are that, and they stem from these sort of well, I mean, he'll go on to call them sort of exemplary events, but the nature of wounds themselves. And Bosquet, for sure, is just some of his stuff. I was reading the 2 or 3, I used Google Translate, not saying it was a good translation, but the stuff I was reading was really fantastic and interesting. Some of his lines are pretty great, even in English. But the line Deleuze has here, sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that I think one of the key elements is in the center of that paragraph. So he's holding up Gilles Bosquet as a kind of exemplar of someone whose relationships they're wounded and therefore can be called stoic. And he says after that quote, "My wound existed before me. I was born to embody it." And he says it is a question of attaining this will that the event creates in us, becoming the quasi-cause of what is produced within us, the operator. And this is a kind of development of what he said last week. So it's this kind of notion of will and a kind of relationship with the event. So this is, again, like I said, it's developing further the theme from last week, I would say.
So you're saying that the will is a kind of form of representation that includes the expression of the event, the wound?
Sorry. Well, he says it's obtaining the will, and he said becoming the quasi-cause of what is produced within us. So we have this relation of causal relationship towards the event within us, but it's not a cause in terms of as cause and event. It's what he calls a quasi-cause. So we do have this relationship with the event.
Right.
And he goes on to say, I mean, I think a lot of this is kind of repetition, but I think that's what obviously Deleuze does a lot. He does kind of bring things he's already said. So he's keeping everything in place, so to speak.
Right.
He says, so he says, within us, the operator. So that was a quote from last week. The last thing he calls that our role is as an operator,
yeah,
producing surfaces and linings. So that last week we talked about the hem, in
right,
which the event is reflected, finds itself again as incorporeal and manifests in us the neutral splendor which it possesses. So it manifests, so through this, it manifests the sense of the event is manifested in its neutral splendor, because what characterizes the event, or the sense of the event, is that it's generative, it's productive, but it's also impassible. It's neutral.
How does
So he
the,
says that, yeah.
I just want to clarify, how does the representation and the language play a part in this?
I think he comes to that later on. But if you remember from last week, if you talked about the actor representing is a representation, and the character that he's playing is separate from that representation. So I think that the notion of representation will be repeated within this, I would say.
Okay.
but the representation contains within it the expression, and that is the kind of vital thing I would say within this. This is what's expressed, the sense of what's expressed.
The express is the will.
He says we must attain. No, I think he says we must attain the will, but I think at this point he's talking about the neutral splendor, the sense which he possesses in its impersonal and pre-individual nature. So again, it's kind of repetition, but it's developing it into a different direction. And at the end, we have that quote, I think, from Gilles again. So it's the idea of going towards the event. In this case, Busquet, something happens to him. He has this wound, but rather than let it rule, he kind of goes towards it. He has this. He kind of makes it his own almost, and this is the kind of this is where the will is enacted as what Deleuze calls a quasi cause of what is produced within us. And in that sense, we've become what Deleuze calls the operator. This is the relationship to the event.
Well, and I think it's important actually to take a second and talk through what he means by willing the event, because it's a phrase he uses a lot, and we didn't spend a lot of time on it last week because obviously we're reading the entire section. There's a lot of stuff in each one of these series, but the willing section of what willing means essentially is that when a sage wills an event, it's the sage utilizes their place in the making of sense in order to create an embodiment of it, the quasi cause of such a thing. It's the awareness that we become the quasi cause of events. It's sort of the nature of how events function, as we got into last week, and we will get into that. It depends kind of where you're at in the philosophy of the sky, the earth, or the surface. But the line would be, how could the sage be the quasi cause of the incorporeal event and thereby will its embodiment if the event were not already in the process of being produced? The quasi cause does not create, it operates and wills only what comes to pass. I think it's worth spending a little bit of time. I don't think my definition of willing is wrong here, but I think it's important we at least nail it. I'd love to know if I'm off, because it's a pretty important part for the rest of this.
Yeah. I think the general understanding of will is that it's a process of choice, of choosing. So in a kind of relation to ethics, will is something that chooses the path, the ethical path, shall we say. But if from last week, the word that Deleuze uses for will, and he uses this Greek term proeresis, which has a sense of choosing. So again, it's a choice being made. And sorry.
Also, is the will the reference to Nietzsche's will to power?
No, I think it's a general reference to philosophy as a whole. I think the will is obviously a central term within philosophy, and I think that, like I was saying earlier, that it has a relationship. I'm talking very generally, rather than it has a relationship to ethics. This is why it's within this 20th section on the moral problem.
Yeah.
So the will is the notion of choosing, and so the word that Deleuze uses about the will, the Stoic will, is proeresis, which means the ability to choose, the choice involved as giving or withholding a sense. So it's this kind of notion of giving or withholding a sense.
Yeah, because later on he talks about the amor fati, and that is a major concept in Nietzsche's idea of the will to power.
Yeah, true. It's also obviously a Stoic term.
Right.
So the description at the end of the 20th series, when he's talking about the Zen archer and the way that a sage operates, I'm hesitant to say will is the same as like making a choice. There is an element or two, as he talks before in the earlier part of that, on divination. And that sages play towards the logic, and Stoic ethics play towards the pole of logic, not so much the physical divination of things, the physical pole. And the phrasing as I read it is essentially that, and I'll read from the notes I've been reading off of too. The sage waits for this pure event, its eternal truth in aeon, and wills is the quasi-cause of its embodiment in states of affairs. The wills is a unique phrasing. I'm not sure necessarily, maybe this is where choice happens, but it's not directly just I'm making choice between A and B or making selections, but much more by willing, by becoming the quasi-cause, by embodying this event, you've also immediately sort of inherited the cause of such a thing as well. That it's the knowledge that quasi-cause is necessary as sort of the divination of sense, the way sense is sort of manufactured in this entire thing, necessitates this entire process. It manifestation, if we want to say, in the series. And so the pure event and the sage waiting for it and then willing it to exist doesn't feel wildly off. And I mean, that's my understanding of willing. It's going to be important. I'm harping on this because the rest of this event is very much about this type of thing and gets into Nietzsche, gets into these elements. And so I think it's worth spending a few minutes on. Sorry. It's this opening section where it's to the extent that events are actualized in us, they wait for us and invite us in. They signal us. My wound existed before me. I was born to embody it. Is the way a sage looks at the event, taking on the quasi-cause and embodying it. The final line, everything was in order with the events of my life before I made them mine. To live them is to find myself tempted to become their equal, as if they had to get from me only that which they have that is best and most perfect, which is a phenomenally kind of great way to talk about how when we become the quasi-cause of the events, how we play with them and what events sort of, create around us in aeon, looking back and forth versus within Chronos. It feels like.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, I think that there isn't an element of choice within this, though. There is the kind of direct choice of the person to do this rather than being the victim of the wound. They make the choice to actually embody it within themselves. And I feel that that's the kind of notion of the stage and the kind of being the archer kind of embodies the event. So it gives, the quote is, gives the body to the incorporeal effect.
Yes, but embodying aim, the archer is a great example. Aim is the body of the bowman himself. The arrow flies, but creates its own target. It's things within themselves, sort of as a start point. Again, to go back to the idea of the quasi-cause. And so, yeah, there is choice in the sense of I'm making a decision to wait for, as he calls it, the ideal event or the perfect event, and then embodying them, willing the embodiment and actualization of the pure event in a state of affairs, is the phrasing I think he uses in the previous. Someone else, please. I'm sure it's Derek and I can do this all day without question. I'd love anyone else's thoughts. Bruin, you haven't been with us for a while. You got anything on the 21st series, first paragraph here? Or you want to wait until we dive a little bit further? Very nice. Bruin's jet lagged, which happens. Well, any other comments on this sort of first opening part? Because I think if we generally are going to agree with that, then we get to move on to the critique of ethics. And that has the great line in the next paragraph that I love, which is, ethics makes no sense at all, or this is what it means and has nothing else to say. It is not to be unworthy of what happens to us. To grasp whatever happens as unjust and unwarranted is, on the contrary, what renders our sores repugnant, veritable resentment of the event. And it's a really great sort of paragraph diving into, well, I'll open it. Does anyone want to take a crack at what this one sort of means? Maybe besides Derek and me, who's because we will, I'm sure we can.
Yeah, I just want to ask, well, what does it mean by resentment of the event? The idea of resentment is a major concept also from Nietzsche, right? But what does it mean by this resentment of the event?
I'll take a crack at this because I was diving a little bit deeper and rereading Nietzschean philosophy last night, because resentment is itself a fascinating thing, and Deleuze's sort of critique of Nietzsche, or sort of, it's less a critique and more running with Nietzsche, I suppose. I would say that he's actually there, that sentence, veritable resentment of the event is what he's saying resentment is, ultimately. It's a veritable version of it. There is no other ill will. The ability for people to look at events themselves and attach to them, and again, have that the nature of resentment under Nietzsche sort of as a thing, the way that it operates, the reassignment of pain that has to do with one's own inferiority against things, the blaming of a scapegoat. Such things happen to events. Like he's arguing that that's where it comes from, that it's a resentment of the event itself. Might be far off, but that's how I read that sentence, and kind of flows through the rest of the paragraph.
Does it also mean the curtailment of the will to power? That because is that how he defines resentment?
Yeah, ultimately it comes back on the person. Yeah, usually.
Right. So it's kind of a reversal of one's will to power, right? Instead of expressing the will to power, it's a kind of the opposite. Perhaps a repression or a indirect expression of it.
I mean, I think there is a very valid reading to say that it's also, you can make the case that the whole thing about the relationship between resentment and the pure event is that Deleuze is saying that, resentment can very much mean the affirmation of, or can very much mean, the projection of a sort of teleology. And of course, the pure event would be completely opposed to that, in the sense that, well, resentment we can see, for example, slave morality. You define your existence through something else, or you define it through the ending of something else, right? And then you look at, your ontology is basically a system of predicates and subjects. So if you read the event as, something contingent, resentment would sort of be destroyed in that process.
Right. So with Gay, instead of affirming his wound, or he adopts the attitude of resentment, in which he would feel be completely different from how he's describing what he did, right? Which is the opposite of affirming, right? Affirming the event.
Exactly. I mean, this is a big thing. If you read something like Nietzsche in philosophy, he goes really in depth into this whole idea of how the will to power has been misread, because the will to power, people have read the will to power as being supposedly teleological, and the will to power is not that at all. But the will to power is something that's the will to power should be understood as a differential concept.
I'm doing my best not to dive too deep into Nietzschean philosophy because I haven't picked it up in a while. To stick to this text and how he's talking, though, I have a slightly different sort of maybe direction on it. The event is not what occurs, an accident. It is rather inside what occurs. It is the purely expressed. It signals and awaits us in accordance with the three preceding determinations. It is what must be understood, willed, and represented in that which occurs. This idea of the way the event functions and the way that we can take it on, the resentment of the event, this ill will, the immoral, what really is really immoral, he immediately says, is the use of moral notions like just, unjust, merit, or fault. What does it mean then to will the event? It is to accept war, wounds, and death when they occur? No, it's highly probable that resignation is only one more figure of resentment, since resentment has many figures. If willing the event is, primarily, to release its eternal truth, like the fire on which it is fed, this will would reach the point at which war is waged against war. Wound would be the living trace and scar of all wounds. We are faced with a volitional intuition and a transmutation. To my inclination for death, said Bosquet, what was a failure of the will I will substitute for a longing for death, which would be the apotheosis of the will. To me, it's a slightly different take. Maybe I'm misunderstanding Varun and JK, but this is much more of a push towards this idea that the events have been laid out and how we relate to them, or what relation we make with them, or how we embody them, is actually the discussion he's having, and that the thing that renders our souls repugnant is to call these things unjust and unwarranted, to lay such names upon the events and these moral decisions. Those things, by doing so immediately, we've actually placed ourselves in a place of resentment of the event itself, almost subservient to it.
Yeah, and he says so we're faced with a volitional intuition, so that's an intuition through the will and a transmutation. And he gives the example of Bousquet. He says, who goes from being inclined towards death, which he describes as a failure of the will, and towards a longing for death, which he describes as the apotheosis of the will. And Deleuze says, there is, from this inclination to this longing, there is a certain respect no change except the change of the will. So the will itself is changed, and it's this. I think this is what the transmutation refers to.
And it's this line. They're just recently on the server, it was posted, this wonderful piece a few years ago from David Graeber. It's coming out in a new book as well, called How to Change the Course of Human History. And when Nietzsche first really is talking about his master-slave setup, and he's talking about resentment, he makes the comment that only the slave would come up with the idea of equality, which is a difficult thing to sort of understand as a thing, like why that's a problematic. But Graeber makes a huge argument very much in that direction, that the moment we make equality the conversation, we're no longer talking about the actual workings of things. There is no such thing as a thing called inequality. Inequality is the version he talks about it, but we no longer now talk about power structures or capital or class power. The word equality, quote, is practically designed to lead half measures and compromises. One can imagine overthrowing capitalism or breaking the power of the state, but it's difficult to imagine eliminating inequality. In fact, no one even knows what that would even mean. And as Nietzsche talks about it, the creation of equality by the slaves, it puts them in a spot where that's then this way that they've reframed the discussion in order to put them on equal footing once again. The way that they've done it, inequality is more just, inequality is just. It's like this is the problem with the conversation in and of itself, resentment at a base. At least that's, again, my reading of it, but it's, I think, a pretty important distinction that he seems to be running pretty hard with here. And as he moves forward, he says the line, "It is in this sense that the amor fati is one with the struggle of free men. My misfortune is present in all events, but also a splendor and brightness which dry up misfortune and bring about that event, once willed, is actualized on the most contracted point, on the cutting edge of an operation. All this is the effect of the static genesis and of the immaculate conception." It's a really extraordinary way to sort of twist that in line with what, Graeber argues in this article. I'll repost it again here. It's a wonderful read, by the way. But it seems to be the same type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between inequality is a big part. If you read, like, the final chapter of Difference and Repetition, the debate Deleuze has with himself is he goes into this discussion, well, if we say something is, let's say that we say something is more or less than another thing. Well, what we do, we can only, make those qualitative claims or quantitative claims is when we understand that there's a common unit of measure. But we've already, in that manner, your inequality presupposes equality or something like that. And I mean, this also goes back to Bergson, especially the first chapter of Time and Free Will. But Deleuze does have an interesting critique of that too.
And so,
Yeah, I think this is interesting because I think it gives a clear line to this notion of amor fati. I think a good example is that example he gives of Bousquet. He says, from an inclination to death, so being resentful of his condition, being wounded. He says a failure of the will. He has a longing for death, and this is a concrete example of this amor fati, I would say.
and it's just to go back to the resentment, because it's just such a great line of flight for me, just because to go back to Nietzsche and the way he described it and talked about it, the reason slaves made the decision to go down the road of equality and to have that conversation is because it meant that they could say things like, we aren't born slaves. Wouldn't they? Absolutely were. We aren't, like, I'm not saying we should be slaves. When they were actually born, then they were slaves pretty much immediately. The bondage is unjust. We should not be ashamed of this. Instead, I don't have to hate my position in life. I can now justify it through this larger idea and the way that I'm relating to the literal events around me, the chain of the events. And this is resentment at its basic level. And I think, again, this goes back to why I think what he's talking about here is resentment at its core is resentment of the event. Because the events are just the line of things that have trailed behind me. I get to pick the ones that I want as part of my life and make moral judgments as to which one does or doesn't mean I am a thing or this thing. And the nature of sort of amor fati at its basic level is, from Nietzsche, as he wanted us to do, is to accept and love sort of this sort of nature movement forward, this whatever may happen, to embrace it fully. But I think Deleuze goes a very different direction here as we talk through sort of the next couple paragraphs how we can act on it and how we can understand sort of our place and how to relate to these events. And that's, I think it's we'll just jump, because I think the interesting way he talks about doing it is through the lens and his sort of understanding of acting. I don't know if anyone here is like a formerly trained actor. I've done a little bit of that, classes and performance and things, but really loved his take on what an actor is and how they play. Does anyone want to jump in and talk through their thoughts on that or expand on it? No, it wasn't with Jim Varun. I didn't act. Just a business person, sadly.
Just a simple thinking I would like to add to your thought. Kind of a hejangtimong, like resentment, maybe the power of, actualizing event. And then that is the point of formulating or forming singularity of event, because every actor's the point of resentment or hejangtimong would be different, and that is kind of as stated in Nietzsche and philosophy, like it kind of like a justifies one's kind of position or kind of the point, and then it forms like a morality, like against something general as far as I understand. So if you go further, two pages further, you can find the actor, how actor acts like in terms of like Kronos and God as a Kronos and the actor as an iron. So what I understand is like a so-called God, something general, something Kronos is like something like a generality. It has to do generality, but the point of the event is like a singularity, which is like where the past and then or the future are all mingled, and then which also like forms a singularity of an actor, something like that. So my point here is that resentment is quite important. The power which makes events singular. Because at the point, all kind of like event becomes quite individual, quite personal, because everybody's like point of resentment would be different.
I think the point is that he says that we mustn't have resentment. So to be stoic means not to have resentment, and the key again, it goes back to this notion. In a sense, what we're talking about here is ethics. He says, "What is ethics? Become worthy of what happens to us." So not to have resentment towards what happens to us. So at the end of that previous paragraph, he says to become worthy of what happens to us, and thus to will and release the event. And I think this, in a sense, is what the actor is doing: is releasing the event to become the offspring of one's own event, and thereby to be reborn.
It's let's talk about the actor, because it's maybe worth also going a little bit deep into his understanding of the craft of acting. Ollie, mute yourself. If you could just real quick.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Happens to all of us. Don't worry. The way that the actor works, an actor on stage in film or anything, and I'm going to do my best not to bring up time image or movement image because this stuff seems to stem straight from this very nicely. To me, I think it dovetails really well. But it's this idea that the actors, what they're doing and why they're doing it, their job, what they're playing at, is not, we'll say, the normal existence. It's the actor is not a god, as he says here, but more an anti-god. While God is present in the circle of everything, the actor is always aiming at something in the future or dealing with something in the past. And that is this nature is that the actor or actress represents is something always in the future, already in the past, whereas his or her representation is impassible and divided, unfolded without being ruptured, neither acting nor being acted upon. It is in this sense there is an actor's paradox. The actor maintains himself in the instant in order to act out something perpetually anticipated and delayed, hoped for and recalled. The role played is never that of a character, but it is a theme constituted by the components of the event, that is, by the communicating singularities effectively liberated from the limits of individuals and persons. The way an actor plays is not as the thing. They're actually always pointing towards something in the future or past, which is a fantastically interesting way to sort of talk about it. But as such, the actor perfectly actualizes the event, but in a way which is different from the depth of things. The actor redoubles this cosmic or physical actualization in his own way, which is singularly superficial, but because it is more distinct, trenchant, and pure. Thus, the actor delimits the original, disengages from it an abstract line, and keeps from the event only its contour and its splendor, becoming thereby an actor of one's own events, a counter-actualization. By playing the role, being aware of it, and able to look to the future and past in a different way than being sort of within Chronos, it creates a different type of actualization of the event, a counter-actualization, which I really, really like the ideals of. Hope that was an okay explanation. There's a lot of complexity here, but I really, really love that a lot.
It really is a form of representation then, right? Or what the actor is doing, just like any kind of art or any kind of expression
Yes.
of the event. And he's doing he's performing and representing, what the um, character, the story of the character. But it's it's a form of counter actualization.
And it's because it's always not here. Like an actor is never just the thing that they are. There's always an anticipation or a recall back to the past moment in everything actors do. The entirety of their existence is such a thing because of the way a lot of entertainment and story works and things like that. But it's also a really interesting way to sort of talk through how this happens and how we deal with that, because the counter actualization here is the important part, and that the actor, by giving body to the event, by embodying it in this unique way, isn't simply actualizing it in the same way that someone who deeply embodies the event and takes it on tries to do their best to fully actualize it. There's a counter actualization that plays with it in a unique way.
Yeah, so the actor, so he talks about the actor's paradox. So the actor maintains himself in the instant. So the actor is bodily there in the instant in order to act out something perpetually anticipated and delayed. So it's perpetually, what he's acting out is in the future and in the past at the same time, hoped for and recalled. So this and the role, so this is the paradox. The actor is there in the instant, but what he's acting out is not there in a sense. It's coming or it's gone. So he says the role played is never that of a character. It is a theme, the complex theme or sense, constituted by the components of the event. That is, by the communicated singularity, effectively liberated from the limits of individuals and persons. So it has this impersonal and pre-individual kind of quality, which we've come across previously a number of times. And he talks about how the actor does that. So he says, the actor strains his entire personality in a moment. So again, the moment, the instant, which is always further divisible in order to keep himself, open himself up to the impersonal and pre-individual role. So again, the relationship is the actor and the role. The actor is himself, he's there in the moment, but the role he's playing is characterized as impersonal and pre-individual, which is, as we kind of know, is a definition of the transcendental field, which his acting is operating in. So this notion of time, so whereas God is this eternal present, the actor kind of, it releases almost the sense in terms of the aeon, the always to come and always gone by. And this is how he does this. So this is the actors actualizing the event. And he said, but it's in a way that's entirely different from the actualization of the event in the depth of things. So actualization means the notion of making it appear, making it kind of real almost. Although perhaps real is not the right word, actual is the proper word. But it's not like it's in the actual, so events can be actualized in bodies themselves, but he said the actor does it in a very different way. He does it at the surface.
Right. So he's representing the actualization, similar to what Bousquet, right, does, is describing as doing, right?
Yes, I believe so.
So it'd be useful to, as you say, this notion of counter-actualization is quite important. So it'd be quite useful perhaps to define that a bit more. Because he said this is what so it's rather than an actualization, as say, the events of bodies is an actualization, I would say. What he's saying is a counter-actualization. And he said he keeps from the event only its contour and its splendor, which I kind of personally relate to this notion of impassibility and productivity. And he becomes the actor of one's own events. So it's this kind of, perhaps it's relation to amor fati again, this kind of embracing it up, so it kind of belongs to us almost.
And there's
sorry.
No, please, Ollie, go.
Apparently, like counter actualization is like is against the amor fati as a destiny. So by having counter actualization, human being as an actor is against like the order of God, like something already like destined, and then we can make everything like a more lively and vivid, so make everything more splendid. So the point here is that counter actualization, how do I say, like make possible all kind of becomings, like instead of like make us like a stay in one point at one point as kind of part of amor fati, we can like make ourselves like transform to something like that.
Yeah, I think there's a sense in which the actor, as Deleuze says, strains his, I'm trying to find a quote, strains his entire personality in the moment. So he's straining his personality, his, I don't know, personality, his subjective, I'm not sure, let's call it personality, to open himself to the impersonal and pre-individual. So he is working with his personality in order to open himself up to the impersonal and the pre-individual. So again, this is this paradox that he's saying, that he's talking about. And that thing he opens himself up to the impersonal pre-individual is has the temporal nature of the ion. So it's always, as we said, ion is always coming, about to appear, and it's always past. It's always in the future and past. And this is how he actualizes the event. So it's a counter-actualization. It's not the result of bodies. So I would say the kind of actualization of events is the cause caused by bodies, but the actor is a quasi-cause. In a sense, it becomes, therefore, it's a counter-actualization.
Yeah, it's keeping the event via the actor in the past or future. By doing so, they've basically limited the actual event itself sort of in a abstract line within Aeon. This always in the future, always in the past, never now, not the divine present of the whole. It is infinitely divisible. The line right after what you were saying, Derek, is the other one I really like. The actor is always acting out other roles when acting one role. There's a sort of stated or unfully stated sort of multiplicity of things that an actor is doing, because again, it's not one element in Aeon. That'd be Super Chronos style. Instead, it's much more that as they're dealing with these things, or these pre-personal or non-personal, whatever phrasing we want to have around it, the pre-individual roles, the actor brings the event and actualizes it sort of into a single sort of singularity that stays within Aeon, that ultimately just maintains affirmation of it existing, rather than bringing in all the other judgments that he opened the chapter by talking about, the ethics of things, the demand of things being just or unjust, without saying, oh, this woe is me for X happening. I identify so deeply with it. I am this, or that is me. It's embracing the event in a different way, placing it in Aeon, playing with it in Aeon in a slightly different setup. It's that's for me. I don't know. It's to grasp whatever happens as unjust and unwarranted is what renders our sores repugnant. This doesn't do that. By nature, the actor almost maintains and keeps the splendor of the event, I think is the phrasing he uses. This affirmation of it, which is a really unique, again, a very stoic way of looking at things, as a poetic way of life, even though he's hesitant to say such a thing.
Right. The paradox is that the actor is an actual person who's performing a representation of something that is counteractual.
Yes.
And right, so it's kind of a paradox that he's in two worlds at the same time. He's in Chronos, and he's also in this realm of the ion. So how is that possible? That's the paradox of that we've talked about before in those other chapters, right? Those other series.
Yes, I believe so. I like that. And the next part I want to sort of jump into a little bit, because I'd love, Derek, your thoughts on it, because the next paragraph where he talks through the physical mixture is exact only at the level of the whole, in the full circle of the divine present, Chronos. But with respect to each part, there are many injustices and ignominies, many parasitic and cannibalistic processes, which inspire our terror at what happens to us and our resentment at what occurs. That part feels like a response to sort of the general critique of a lot of Stoics. Wait, are you saying everything's the same? Everything's fine? Like, God, there's bad things that happen. You don't believe in bad things? And he's like, no, there's all of that. It's the whole, all in, is this perfect mixture. There's still like bad things. There's bad parts for sure. The humor part, which is the second half of this, I think it was JC last night, and I went for like an hour trying to find a satisfying way to talk through this, and we couldn't. Humor is inseparable from a selective force. In that which occurs, an accident, it selects the pure event. In eating, it selects speaking. Bosquet listed the characteristics of the humor actor to annihilate his or her tracks whenever necessary. Quote, to hold up among men and works their being before bitterness. To assign to plagues, tyrannies, and the most frightful wars the comic possibility of having reigned for nothing. In short, to liberate for each thing its immaculate portion, language and will, amor fati. The way we talked about this last night is the sort of nature of humor to, in the face of sort of the awful shit that we talk about, ultimately places us and makes us talk about the existence of humanity being who we are, our elements before we get to bitterness, before the horrific. I think of Jojo Rabbit as maybe an example of such a thing, where it's utilizing humor in a way where absolutely events within the film are dark and horrifying, but there is a wonderful beauty to the story, to the thing as well. And it feels like he's aiming towards that. Am I far off?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, because I think this is a role of humor, because it kind of, in a sense, intervenes prior to the kind of resentment breaking out. And he says at the end of that paragraph, it says that it liberates for each thing its immaculate portion. So language, will, amor fati.
Yeah, like there's an essence of humor that we always push back towards almost this cosmic, futility of things. That there's a humor to such elements, and the humor always plays at the pure event of what occurs, which I think is an interesting description and also fairly accurate. If we go back to the series on humor, which we did, which is its own whole thing. I suggest you go back and listen to it. If you haven't, we have it recorded. It's somewhere. It's the 19th series. Plays heavily with that. Yeah. Please, any questions, thoughts so far before we continue moving on? Or should we deal with Jack? Should we deal with your discussion? Do you want to talk about your question or your debate you're having in text right now?
Yeah, why didn't you act for James Cameron?
Oh
No,
my God,
no,
I hate
was
you so
trying to be
much.
so rude. You gotta get in line for that one, buddy. And it's a long line. Like Six Flags, but no. Yeah, I guess I'm reading. As usual, I guess I'm focusing on a paragraph versus the text. So I always have the risk of the forest for the trees and all that. But as I read that second paragraph, and what I've been trying to piece together as you're going through the actors and the resentment on that is, it sounds to me like what Deleuze is doing is he's raising the question of ethics, basically through Stoicism, Nietzsche, and Freud, right? At a very basic level. And so, one level, he is doing the critique of teleology, right? Which is, it can be a problem in virtue ethics, especially for Aristotle, but certainly in some deontological realms too. Not as much as some other ethical theories, though. So, as I'm reading this, it looks like he being Deleuze, it looks like what he's doing here is he's trying to turn the question of ethics not so much to a question of character and virtue as it more immediately would be for Aristotle through categories like just and unjust, perhaps the warranted and unwarranted, or because obviously intent would be critical there, but even more so something like the teleology of happiness, for instance, or continence and incontinence are the two big ones in Aristotle, or two of the six big ones. But yeah, as I'm reading this, it looks to me like Deleuze is moving now there. Is he's going to basically move it into a question of the, if not the actor, I guess the operator's potential to move from the body to the effect. And in doing so, right, it becomes a question of, is one in a condition where the will is toward that which is in the event, right, in all of its humor and playfulness, perhaps, or is one in a condition where the will is perhaps more all-encompassing, right? And in that sense, I think that's where he's getting the resentment, where one's worthiness is a kind of state of being prefigured by a category, right? As opposed to not only an act of becoming, right, but basically it sounds like he's almost saying like a place in the event, right, and a will that is achievable. I shouldn't say achievable, that is possible in the event, as opposed to perhaps being sort of it's almost like mistaking the will as that which put everything into motion, right? And that would kind of be where your resentment, I think, precipitates from.
I hesitate on a couple points. To me, the conversation here is not about necessarily becoming the cause. It's understanding that there is no such thing as cause, not in the same way that we may mean it classically. And instead, I'll go with the line I used last night. I'll use again here from Wei Wu Wei, one of my favorite Taoist writers. Play your role in the comedy, but no, play your part in the grand comedy, but don't identify with your role. There's a separation that comes between understanding why you're doing a thing or playing the part and being aware that you're doing such of a thing or taking it on. And that to me is what the big difference he's talking about here, that the sage is aware that they are a quasi-cause, and very specifically not a cause, a quasi-cause, and that by actualizing the event, they have a power to do things because we all actualize events. It's what we do. It's the nature of sense and how it's sort of produced. The way that we go about that and how we sort of structure that into our experience and our plane of immanence is the important thing. And the push here, I believe, is that he wants us to consider essentially acting as we go about our daily lives, that we take a look at the events and instead of actualizing them in the way that slave might against the masters by assuming and taking on the entire story as if it was their identity in the life as it's intended to be led. Instead, we need to step outside of such a sort of paradigm and instead grasp the event itself and only allow it to actualize through a counter-actualization. Remove the power of resentment. Play in that space that allows us to allow the event to be exactly what it is, essentially an accident, and talk about it as such, rather than connecting it to a very large, giant, I used to use the term zipper for the way that we make sense of propositions and combine them. But that's, I think, a significant part he's talking about doing here is understanding that we do that, that masters utilize resentment to make slaves their allies, which is an extraordinary truth. And I think a thing he's very much against here, for sure. And I think instead it's about understanding the role we can play, how to do it, how to be the actor, and utilize this counter-actualization by keeping the event actualized within Aeon and not Chronos, by having this be a thing that we're constantly playing at in the future and past, but being aware right here, we are waiting, we are sitting, we are the sage in this time. And this changes our relation to event. It allows us to sort of, I don't know how to put it. I think I lost my train of thought there. I had a thing going, I promise.
To give a brief response, then, I'm not sure I fully agree with your disagreement because, well, on one hand, there are causes, right? They're bodies, and that's the Stoic ontology, right? Is bodies and effects, or causes, quasi-causes, and so on that level, and that's why I posted that quote, which I posted as soon as we started this discussion. So just to introduce it then. So it's basically, what is the question of the relationship of bodies and events, or causes and effects, right? And to your point, I think where we absolutely agree is that causes here are not the genesis of the genesis. Am I right? That's not the genesis he's working through, as though everything starts from a causality, as we're used to in a colloquial sense, any more than everything must necessarily begin from a first body, right? That's how you get that kind of fate through their complex relationships. And so Deleuze writes, right? So to take the quote then, a sort of leaping place of the whole body, which exchanges its organic will for its spiritual will. So right, there's a movement of the operator from the whole, from the body, from the causality, to this point of the operator, which I think is what you're talking about with the sage and their role there, right? It's the spiritual will, which is a rather interesting move that he's making there, right? Because at that point, I think some of what you're saying puts into place actually quite nicely, because the operator would then become, has the possibility of the quasi-cause, or it has the possibility of effects and simulacra, right? And that's where you're getting this aeon and this these points about becoming and that, right? And that would be, to highlight that last point, I think that would start to show how the master and slave morality is being redeployed here, right? Because if we take the master morality and just the classic distinction of, like, the Greeks and how they understood virtue and that, perhaps as a kind of becoming worthy, and it's usually the Christians kind of get picked on here, right? But it's important to note that Christianity and that morality draws on the Greeks and the Stoics, right? And actually, Roderick makes an interesting point about there being a connection between Stoicism and early Christianity, which is kind of critical here, because I think that's part of what Deleuze is actually changing in this process, so as to make it that this question of resentment would be, like you're saying, this willing of the event as the event, right? It's almost megalomaniac, although that might be a little bit misleading, as opposed to willing within the event, right?
What about bringing Great Gatsby as an example of Cronus and Iron? Like Gatsby lives at prison, but he also lives in a time of iron at the same time. For him, like event is like a counter-actualized as far as I understand. Or what about Citizen Kane? Like maybe we can like I don't know, like put this kind of idea into those kind of movies. Like it's much easier to understand, like the how like Iron and Kronos are working.
Does anyone have a master-slave morality analysis of The Great Gatsby prepared? I'm caught off guard here.
I don't, but I can, in my head, feel like there is one. Wait, the nature of the sort of slave experience, as he's talking about it here specifically, in resentment and the playing through sort of those elements. I think, I mean, there's a lot of ties to that, but again, to me, the underlying question here, and it's the one that is, I guess I would love to understand more, kind of what you mean, Jack, because I guess I didn't grasp kind of your response there. The way that the event plays, the way that the resentment can be utilized, is, as he says in this last part of this section, the psychopathology which the poet makes his own is not a sinister little accident of personal identity or an individual unfortunate accident. It is not the milkman's truck which has run over him and left him disabled. It is the horsemen of the 100 blacks carrying out their pogroms against the ancestors in the ghettos of Vilna. The blows received to the head did not happen during a street brawl, but when the police charged the demonstrators. If he cries out like a deaf genius, it is because the bombs of Guernica and Hanoi have deafened him. These examples that are here, I think these are from, God damn it, is this Blanche Show? Should have looked this up.
It sounds like Blanche, though. At least the point about the Holocaust and the pogroms, that does sound like him.
It's the play here that he's talking about is what he says right before it. All forms of violence and oppression gather together in a single event which denounces all by denouncing one. It's this element that we get to play with rather than taking the event and having the event become sort of, I don't know how to put it, part of this larger chain of my own life, but instead allowing the event to sort of stand on its own, allowing it to be its own thing, allowing it to be what it is, gives us a chance sort of to take a different direction on it and to play it against other events and to sort of measure it that way rather than to bring in an ethical direct judgment on all these events and have them creating some semblance of a score of whether or not life is just or unjust in my world, which does no service for anyone, as they make the argument for, and I think Nietzsche does significantly.
And I guess I would say, I think this is why Ollie B's request to move to Fitzgerald is probably helpful. I think it is in some ways a question of how we're understanding master and slave morality here. And I suppose you could. I never like doing the tragic hero thing with Gatsby, and maybe that's because I resent high school. I don't know. But erring on the maybe erring on the other hedge of that bet, I suppose you maybe could make a case that with Gatsby, right, there is something to the idea that he um, has this current throughout the novel, or I guess the DiCaprio flick, if that's what we're going with. I think there's been like 20 renditions of it. But anyways, I suppose you probably could make a case that there's something about trying to relive the event with Daisy in that, right? And trying to change the wound, right, to rectify it, sense of unjustness. And I haven't given that too much thought. I'm kind of spitballing a little bit here, so consider that improv. And then I suppose if we were to work with like your examples of programs and that, or Brutz's quotation of Deleuze there, right? Somebody like Eli Wiesel might be a good example of that. Somebody that wills within the event as opposed to willing, as opposed to trying to will the event altogether in a sense, right? Because as I'm understanding it, that seems to be the move here, where and it starts to lose some of the master-slave morality problem as we take on this question of willing, but nonetheless, as I'm reading it, that seems to be the distinction he's trying to draw for ethics, is if it is a question of worthiness for becoming, right, it's like this, right, and the resentment that could be perhaps ascribed there, right, perhaps it's a problem of conflating the genesis with the effects, or simply with the bodies, right? Maybe he sees Daisy, and he doesn't really quite grasp the intensities that are available to him. Not to make this too much of a conscious problem, as opposed to, and that's the problem. I don't know if there's a good example of this in Great Gatsby, but maybe with Weasel and what I remember of Night, there being much more difficult conditions in a certain manner of speaking.
But that, I think this to me is like the wrong direction almost, though. Like, not to interrupt, but it's the specific thing he talks about, and this whole section is about. To go back to it, I think, and I'll try to crystallize it really crisply, is that events only exist in Aeon. They will never be a thing I can actually experience. Not possible, because all I can experience within Chronos really is bodies. There's actualization in bodies. Things become realized in bodies. And like Alice growing bigger, I can't ever like realize that in a body alone. It necessitates the incorporeal, the becoming bigger, or anything else. And this is the nature of all events, that they are incorporeal. They don't exist within bodies, literally incorporeal, what that means. And so as such, it's not so much that, like Gatsby focusing on the negative and the bad, and we can all do that, and it's entirely possible. He explicitly even says that, like, wounds, war, death, these awful things are exemplary events, but not because bad shit happens more. It's because the nature of these events have corporeal realities that stick with us in direct ways. So it's not so much that one thing is worse than another, and we can have discussions around that. Those are ethical judgments. This is just or unjust, or righteous or not. They toss that out, because those are like ethical judgments. Instead, like these bad things that happen, they happen more because I'm able to look at death and see fucking death in front of me. Like, I can see it in the sense of, like, there's an exploded corpse next to me, or people starving, or someone's face got shot off, whatever it is. There's a definite reality, a instant Chronos-based reality actualization of it that I'm able to look at. That is very corporeal. But ultimately, all events are incorporeal, and that the reason that the bad shit sticks with us is because of this sort of nature of, they have bodies that I'm able to they have corporeal realities that stick with me, and other things don't. Good shit doesn't. I had a great sandwich the other day. The fuck's the corporeal reality of that? Like, it's never going to happen. I had a rotten meat that I cooked and I left it out and it was rotten, and there were maggots on it. That's the one versus the other. Like, it's one has corporeal effects. The negative seems to more often, as he says. But again, all of this is doing away with and eschewing the idea of just or unjust or worse or better or anything of that sort, and instead letting the event to be where it is. We play within it as actors, always in aeon, but understand within Chronos that it doesn't exist. And that to me is what he keeps sort of driving at. And it's to him, as we get towards the idea of kind of the revolutionary and how we play, like that setup and how we can get away from resentment is kind of the important thing here. Please, Derek, please.
Yeah, I think the next paragraph is quite important, because I think he asked the question about why is every event a kind of plague, war, wound, or death? And in a sense, this relates to the opening when he talks about Stoicism, calls Stoicism a concrete, a poetic way of life, because we're a bit reluctant to, and it's not about designating the most personal relation with a wound. So it kind of goes on to say, why is every kind of a play? So why is every event a kind of plague, war, wound, or death? So this seems to be the events seem to have this character. And he says, is this because they're more unfortunate than fortunate events? He said that no, this is not the case, since the question is about the double structure of every event. So every event, has this double structure, and he's going to go through them and kind of clarify again what he means by this. So with every event, there is the present moment of its actualization. So that every event has this when it's actualized. So it's in which the event is embodied in a state of affairs, an individual or a person. So that this is when the event, there's a kind of bodily actualization of the event in the state of affairs that we see before us, an individual or a person. The moment we designate by saying, "Here the moment has come." So I think that's kind of portentous saying, "Here the moment has come." And it's almost, I kind of relate that almost to death, here the moment has come, there's something that's finally arrived, And he says from this position, so we're at the actual moment when the event has been actualized, we're at that absolute moment. But from that position, we can evaluate the future and the past of the event. So he says the future and the past of the event are evaluated with respect to this definitive present, and from the point of view of that which embodies it. So the event here can be evaluated from this present moment, but also from the point of view of that which embodies it. So it's kind of structured by things beyond it. But then he says this, so he's talking about the way in which the event, the double structure of every event. That's the first structure. The second structure, he says, but on the other hand, there is the future and the past of the event considered in itself. It sidesteps each present. So it's free of this ability to kind of make this judgment about it, being free of the limitations of a state of affairs, impersonal and pre-individual. Impersonal and pre-individual, this is what the event is in this case. It's impersonal and pre-individual, neutral, neither general nor particular, eventum tatum. So it's every event. It has no other present than that of the mobile instant which represents it. And the mobile instant, if we go back to the actor, I would suggest is the actor in there acting the event, which always divided past, future, and form. What must be called the counter-actualization. So in one case, so I would say in the former case of the event as it's embodied, it is my life, which seems too weak for me, slips away a point. An eternal relation to me has become present. The other case, it is I am too weak for life. It is life which overwhelms me, scattering its singularity all about, in no relation to me, nor to a moment determinate as the present, except as an impersonal instant which is divided into still future and already past. I think he gives a really clear kind of notion there of the event, and it's double structure. It has this present, and it has the chronos, if you want to call it that, but it also has the aeon as well. It has this double structure, but the aeon, as he says, sidesteps the present.
I have nothing to add to that. I really like that.
We could go on. Then he goes on. He talks about Maurice Blanchot. So it's ambiguity. So it has this double meaning, ambiguity, and it's essentially that of wound and of death, of the mortal wound. And so again, he's obviously continued to talk about this notion of death, this is the third time, I think at least the third time he's spoken about death.
And going back to the story of the soldier who almost never gets to experience their own death, but sort of becomes eternal in aeon through the act of dying during battle. It's a wonderful sentiment there, and returning to that and playing with it, where it's every event is like death, double and impersonal in its double. It is the abyss of the present, the time without present, with which I have no relation, toward which I am unable to project myself, for in it I do not die, I forfeit the power of dying. In this abyss, they die. They never cease to die, and they never succeed in dying. The they is an amazing discussion sort of in itself, but it's a great piece as well to talk about. And we kind of actually went through the rest of this last paragraph already. I may have jumped a little bit ahead, as happens sometimes. Yeah. Really love this. I liked this whole series. I found it fascinating. And I really liked a lot of the sentiments. It very much felt, I know Ben had to leave, but it very much felt towards the Taoist Zen side of things, and the Stoic sort of interpretation, and bringing Nietzsche into it somehow. I found all of it just really wonderful. Anyone have any last thoughts on this, or before we get to questions? Yeah. Please, JK, go for it.
I wonder if you could elaborate on the they. They is the impersonal singularities of the of the ion, or what he calls ion. But before that, he in the difference of repetition, he calls it the virtual, right? And that's what he's referred to. The they is those singularities that we can never know, but we can represent, right?
Yeah, it's a wonderful sort of poetic sentiment. I think, where is the phrasing he uses around it with brain? It's right after that. It is the they of impersonal and pre-individual singularities, they of the pure event, wherein it dies in the same way that it reigns, or I would say they died in war, or they went to war. There's a semi-universality, yet also deeply singular kind of nature to it, which is really fantastic. It rains. It is going to be, again, 108 degrees in fucking Portland this week. It and they, this sort of global universalist. But that again goes into right away into his other phrasing around things, that there are no private or collective events, no more than there are individuals and universals, particulars and generalities. Everything is singular, and thus both collective and private, which is a wonderful sort of twist on that. And which war, as he asks, is not a private affair. Conversely, which wound is not inflicted by war and derived from society as a whole. there's a nature of events that are both always individual and universal, that are always sort of everyone's. They belong to the it or the they.
Here they, sorry.
No, it's not second. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Here they and the it. I just like want to connect it with the previous part. So, for example, death. If I'm an actor of death, I can't perceive my death at all, and it can be like a sin or how do I say taken by others, which I understand the they. So it's the matter of like how the event is like taken by subjectivity, should I say that way, or agency or agents. So who's taking an event? So for example, I sorry about going back to like a Gatsby, and as well, like at the end of the day, Gatsby died, and then the as a sin in the title of the book, he maybe called Great Gatsby like by other people, and then actually whether Gatsby was great or not, it depends on the 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 subject who takes an event, the person's like the amount of or quality or quantity of resentment, like resentment. So every event can be differently taken by they, them, each individual, each another actor.
To that, I would add, I'm not trying to make fun of Gatsby. I actually like the novel. I just don't fully like the way it was, it's taught in high school. But yeah, to your point there too. I mean, that's nice too because you can see Gatsby. I think there are potentials for him to operate in different roles in that in the novel, right? Um, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's always a few lines that stick out to me in that novel, and one of them is where Gatsby actually says, well, I suppose Nick starts. Nick says something like, you can't make people fall in love with you, or I think he says you can't change the way people love you, or something like that. Um, and of course, Gatsby responds, well, of course you can. Of course you can, old sport, right? Um, but I think that, again, I think that's kind of it, right? This like, and that's the thing, it's tempting to call that like presumptuous. And kind of like you're suggesting, there's a question of how we take the novel. But that would also, I think, move it the wrong direction, right? I think it's a question of what causes, what's going on that where Gatsby is in this position to try and will so much of the event, right? As opposed to trying to will within it, right? Like if you read it as like a master plan, he spends 30 years, on this quest to win this woman's heart and get her to leave her husband and everything. And then he sacrifices, to save her from prison, having put so much into motion. Then that would be the question of the resentment, right?
I just want to, as a note, I am 99% sure that the next series is literally about fucking Great Gatsby and Fitzgerald. Like, I'm not joking. Like, the entire next series is, I think, about this whole thing you're asking. So I almost want to say, can we hold and wait? Because I don't want to jump ahead. Am I nuts? Like, 22nd series, Porcelain and Volcano. It opens with F. Scott Fitzgerald. The entire work of Fitzgerald is this unique development of a proposition. Here is a man and a woman, a couple who has everything. Like, literally, that's the first paragraph of the next series. So I want to put a pin in that till next week because it answers the question directly. Just mention in case, I don't know, maybe Ollie, you were totally aware of that and you were kind of wanting to sort of get us in that direction. But if you're not, just so you know, totally where it goes.
Yeah, let's save it. It'll be interesting.
It is. It's very fascinating. And I'm trying not to like jump too much ahead, but Jack, your take's not totally wrong. I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun one. And I'm really looking forward to what you all have to say about it, because I know you're a little bit more into the lit side than I am. So worth mentioning.
To that, I'm cool with waiting. I'll just say that the point about like the family that has everything in that, I think that comes up in most of Fitzgerald's novels, including Crack Up. I think there's even a reference, which is just an essay. So he does have a point there.
So when he uses the word, they, it sounds like, one can never really experience the event, but you can refer to it, right? You can represent it and refer to it. And it sounds sort of like, reminds me of Wittgenstein saying, what you cannot speak of, you must pass over in silence, that the event is, the silence that you cannot really speak of.
It's, to me, the lesson he's going to aim at, and I think the big lesson of this to sort of push forward, if there is an ethical push, is to understand that the ethical push itself is kind of problematic, because by nature of events, they become actualized. We become the quasi-cause of the event. We own them. We identify with them so fucking deeply they become ours. If we do not do this secondary counter-actualization, which is the double identification, but add addition of that distance because it's not in Chronos, then we get completely fucked by the events. Like, they basically control us. I want to almost say we become the quasi-cause in the same way that in AO right now we're going over inscription and the nature of how the written word seems to have, like, language controlled the written word, but actually in the end the written word owns the language. There's a shift in how we get sort of taken aback by events through their actualization with us as the quasi-cause, because we're not the fucking cause. That's not how it works. But as soon as we identify with that, we're fucked. If we can get to the point where we have the counter-actualization, we can actually have the event itself liberated instead of imprisoning us. It's difficult. It's not a fun process, and it's a whole thing to sort of do. But that is the element we're talking about here. It's almost this distance-based safe movement of the event into Aeon, knowing that it stays there, being aware of it being there, and that gives us the chance to not be owned by the events. Which, I'm not to go into The Great Gatsby. That's a man who was owned by his fucking events.
Right.
Like, fully got wrecked by that shit.
Mhm.
Because they're not his events. He didn't do anything.
So that kind of, freedom from being trapped in the actualization, the state of affairs, is by representing, what the event is, right?
Yeah, it's again, we will the event when we play with it as an actor, when we play with it in that space. But otherwise, if we play at the spot where we become the quasi-cause of it, suddenly we are playing in a place where we have resentment over the event, where the event is part of us, where we're now having to create secondary logical justifications and explain things that are just events, like, in themselves, and things in the past or in the future, or ideas incorporeals, and we're having to utilize these things to justify and to give reason to, and to, as he has the great line that opens this very section, it's one of my favorites, is like, what ethics does has nothing else to say except not to be unworthy of what happens to us. The dive, that is in amazingly simple, and I find I fucking love that line. That's a sage line. That's the nature of ethics, is the demand that we not be unworthy of what happens to us. And that's not really how shit works. Unworthy or worthy or whatever. That's the process of resentment. Again, this is how I read this, but I find it to be a very emancipatory sort of direction for us to look at events, and for us to look at how we can deal with them as sort of a dispossessed actor, if we're aware that we're this actor, if we're aware we're playing this role. And if we're aware as such, we're able to have a discussion around what happened and what it was as it was, rather than bringing a million other significations to the table, as well as ourselves and all of the baggage that that comes with as a quasi-cause, where suddenly we now have to justify and have these big, lofty, Platonic, Socratic discussions around all of this shit, and not actually get at what's actually wrong, what actually happened, what are the bodies that collided together, and how did this work? That is the big deal, is for us to get to that point as much as possible. Only the free man, therefore, can comprehend all violence in a single act of violence, every mortal event in a single event, which no longer makes room for the accident, and which denounces and removes the power of resentment within the individual as well as the power of oppression within society. It's a wonderful line. And it goes with the Blanchot quote. It's Blanchot. It's the line. It's the psychopathology which the poet makes his own is not a sinister little accident of personal destiny or an individual unfortunate accident. It is not the milkman's truck which has run over him and left him disabled. It is the horsemen of the 100 blacks carrying out their pogroms against the ancestors in the ghettos of Vilna. The way we relate to the events and own them and talk of them is how we define them and allow them to define us. The blows to the head did not happen during a street brawl, but when the police charged the demonstrators. So the joke I always tell people whenever you have a broken leg, everyone always says some stupid story. Just say you got it saving, orphans from a burning building. Like, that's the joke, but it's the kind of the point here is how we relate to this, how these things make me. If I stumbled over and I cracked my ribs because I wasn't looking where I was going and I fell down 2 stairs. Do you know how awful that is to tell people? Like, it's the most embarrassing way to crack ribs. I just am fucking old and fat, and that's just, I fell and cracked some ribs. But if I tell a story slightly differently, that I was at a sporting event and it was during a moment of exceptional excitement and I just got overjoyed and I wasn't looking where I was going. I was too excited. One story tells me as the cause. One story defines me by the event. The other is just the thing as it happened. That's it. That's the difference. As I read it. That's what he's getting at.
I've tried that orphanage thing several times. And when you say that after you broke a leg, the interesting thing is you'll be the only one not standing up and clapping.
But it's the idea, is not identifying with the events. Play your part in the comedy, but don't identify with your role. It's just such a wonderful line. Any last comments, notes, thoughts before we start moving on? Any questions for anyone? Derek, you've been quiet for a bit. Am I going way off point?
No, I'm just listening. That's good, interesting discussion.
Well, I have to also then bring up, if you aren't familiar with it, The Enigma of Amigara Fault from Junji Ito, one of the greatest horror comic book. I wouldn't even denote them with comic book. One of the greatest horror thinkers of our time and writer. Sarah posted earlier. The Enigma of Amigara Fault is a story of a fault cracks open and there's these person-shaped holes, and people feel compelled to go into them, and they get lost in them. I'm not going to talk about the ending, but it's this incredibly powerful, incredibly creepy, supposed to be one of the more disturbing comics ever, and that's why it's got the spoiler warning earlier. and you may look at it and go, the fuck, this is nothing. The whole thing is incredibly creepy, but it's this idea that this shape hole, this is my hole. I'm supposed to be in here. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. The attachment to what we are and the events around us, Ito plays with a lot, but it's one of his more directly pointed, perhaps, at this series than most. So if you haven't read it, I highly suggest you read The Enigma of Amigara Fault. It's a wonderful piece. Also, if you're really easily creeped out, don't. It would be bad. It'll give you nightmares. But I fucking love it. Anything Junji Ito is just amazing. Oh. Well, with that, I'll give a last ask out for any comments or questions, and then we'll start closing out because we're nearing 2-hour mark.
Junji Ito quite horrendous. Is kind of afraid to open the book actually. So sorry for my ignorance, but I would like to ask a question about the Chronos again. As far as I understand so far, like events for Deleuze is like a kind of part of the process of multiplicity or becoming, if I understood the right way. Then the time of Chronos is like Deleuze wants to be against the time of Chronos. Like did he like try to be against like the world of Stoicism or the world of a Kantian world, like orderly world, things like that? So the delusion event is like in a way like a explicates like some kind of a process of struggle of an actor to be against the orderly world.
I'm not sure fully, and I think I'm gonna be quick because I'm sure other people have a response. The very simple version to me for Aeon and Chronos is that Aeon is time as it relates to event, which is incorporeal, future, past. Whenever you think of things as that, Chronos is that of bodies. If I were to say, look around on your desk right now, and you're looking around, try to find the thing, and you're looking, that's more the time of Chronos. But if I say, hey, yesterday I found a thing on your desk, now you're working in a place of Aeon, and this change, this shift from Chronos being that of the linked present, which is active or passive, definite, dependent on bodies, this thing versus Aeon, which is that of ideas, conceptions, and events. It allows us to place in a different place of ethics. I want to say this would be like, it's always dividing. It's a place of difference. It's a place of separation. And I think that tends to be more my understanding of Aeon versus Chronos. I'm sorry, that probably didn't answer anything, and I'll stop talking. But
I think you could say that Chronos is circle, like circular, and Aeon is a line.
I guess I would add to that too. If your question is Deleuze against Chronos, I think he's against Chronos in a similar way he would be against like being in Platonism. That is to say, like if they're given like preponderance, right, and you have this problem of the doxa that forms, then there is a problem with Chronos because now it's being, and it's sort of like why I don't like the way Gatsby's taught. The way it's deployed in that, I think, creates the problem, right? So that's where you have the problem of like, so what is Deleuze doing, right? He's criticizing and trying to, rework how Chronos is deployed and the manners in which it's deployed. So I guess I would say he's not trying to tear down Chronos any more than he's trying to tear down being, but he is reworking the way it's used altogether. How I see it.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think he's necessarily anti-Chronos. I think he's more anti the muddling of Chronos and Aeon, and much more about being very aware which is being utilized as part of the sort of process of life. Because again, Chronos, as Derek said, is this circular present, this continually shifting, momentary, immediate, real, imminent reality that I'm dealing with as I'm looking forward right now. Aeon is not that at all, but it's easy to muddle these things together and play with them in different ways, and that becomes, I think, more where he wants to. Yeah, we got to pull back. You got to understand that there's a physically limited time, and there's this other time, and here's how these two versions of time sort of play against each other and how they work with events and bodies. And I think here, as we talk about, like, again, death, because we have the physical reality of experience. I'm seeing death in front of me. I say such a thing. I'm watching a man bleed out. The actual reality of death is so much more because of the way Aeon functions. And so as we start having sense generated through these two, being aware of which one is taking place and which one we're actually engaging in, is one of the ways that we have this emancipatory moment where we're able to dodge resentment and instead play an actor, play the role, and be very aware of how we're sitting in Aeon and time, future and past.
It sounds to me like it's kind of reverse of the idea that the moment is less real than than this the real of the ion or ritual, and because we're used to thinking like from a Buddhist perspective that the real is really the moment of experience, that is constantly becoming, and that's what is most real. But he's reversing that and saying that no, that's just secondary to what is real.
I think one of the things, if you think of time as circular, one of the things that can happen is that it can repeat itself. Whereas if you think of time as a straight line, then it never can do that. And this notion of Aeon, in which the past has gone and the present, the future is yet to come, it's a sense of never arriving at some other place.
Yeah.
And I think the circular idea of time kind of gives rise to a sense of inevitability. Things will happen, so you can understand why certain societies would embrace a circular idea of time, in that things are meant to be.
Right. But then Nietzsche's idea of the eternal recurrence is also kind of like takes us back to the circular experience, right, of repetition. That and he argues for the eternal recurrence by pointing out that there is this circularity in nature itself.
Yeah,
Love that.
true. I just seen it. Sorry.
No, Ollie, please.
True. Like I just seen the movie Edge of Tomorrow, featuring Tom Cruise.
It's a fucking good movie.
What's the name?
Yeah,
What's the name of the movie, Ali?
Edge of Tomorrow.
In Europe or other places, Run, Die, Repeat. It's a great film that plays with the idea of sort of the recurrence of time, Groundhog Day kind of moment. Groundhog Day would actually be another one that sort of plays with this idea. But it's, again, this eternal present that we're stuck in and living in versus the ideal of time or the aeon of it. Fascinating. Any last comments or notes? Because I know we're hitting that 2-hour mark, and I want to make sure we close out because everyone's got, lives that they need to go lead, of course.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Excellent. Tenet was terrible. Not my film. I'll probably have to edit that because I believe Terrence and Kent on the server both absolutely adored Tenet, but not for me. It wasn't for me. Now we'll see. Thank all of you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and cut us out now. It's been a blast. We will next week, as Derek hinted earlier, and I said, we will be diving into the world of Fitzgerald which is exciting as we move beyond event and we head instead into, come on, PDF, get loading. The Porcelain and Volcano, the 22nd series. I look forward to it, and I will talk to all of you guys then.